New York City belonged to the Mafia. 5 families, 5 empires, one unchallenged rule. But in Harlem, one man refused to kneel. Within months, money started disappearing. Territories shifted, and someone inside his own circle would make a call that changed everything. This wasn't a street fight. It was a quiet war. And most people never understood how he survived it. At the top of New York's underworld sat the 5 families. They controlled construction, labor unions, shipping docks, loan sharking, gambling. Politicians owed them favors. Judges owed them silence. Police captains owed them cooperation. They didn't just run crime, they regulated it. If you wanted to operate in New York, you paid tribute. And Harlem on paper was no different. But Harlem wasn't just territory. It was culture, identity, pride. And standing at its center was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Quiet, educated, observant. He read Shakespeare in prison. He studied strategy. And he understood something most gangsters didn't. Fear controls people temporarily. Respect controls them permanently. That difference would define the war. Most people think Bumpy's power came from violence. It didn't. It came from infrastructure. He ran the numbers racket in Harlem, an underground lottery generating millions. But here's what made it different. He kept money inside the community. Local businesses were protected. Families were supported. Churches quietly funded. Harlem didn't see him as a criminal kingpin. They saw him as stability. And that was dangerous. Because the 5 families didn't fear guns, they feared independence. And Harlem was becoming independent. At first, the Mafia tolerated him. He paid percentages, he followed agreements, but revenue reports began to show inconsistencies. Money was flowing, but not fully upward. Someone was redirecting power. Quietly, strategically, the 5 families noticed. They didn't strike immediately, they observed, because moving too aggressively in Harlem could spark unrest, and unrest attracts attention, federal attention. So instead of war, they waited. And Bumpy waited too. This wasn't a gunfight, it was chess. Backroom meetings replaced street confrontations. Selective alliances were formed. Certain Mafia figures were more flexible than others. Bumpy understood divisions inside the 5 families. Rivalries, egos, ambitions. He didn't fight 5 enemies at once. He negotiated with individuals. Divide the power, weaken the unity, strengthen Harlem. But power doesn't shift quietly forever. Soon, pressure increased. Police presence in Harlem spiked. Federal investigators began asking questions about gambling, coincidence, or message. The Mafia wasn't attacking directly, they were squeezing. And then, information started leaking. Details of private meetings surfaced. Financial adjustments were intercepted. Movements were predicted. Someone close to Bumpy was talking. But to whom? The Mafia? Law enforcement? Or both? Trust began thinning. In a world built on loyalty, suspicion is poison, and this is what most people miss. The biggest threat wasn't outside Harlem. It was inside it, because betrayal doesn't just expose strategy, it exposes vulnerability. And vulnerability invites attack. The breaking moment didn't come with sirens. It came with silence. A major numbers shipment was seized, not by rivals, by authorities. Timing was too precise, too clean. Someone had tipped them off. The 5 families now had leverage. They could justify stepping in to stabilize operations. In other words, take control. Harlem stood at a crossroads. Bumpy had 2 options, submit or escalate. He escalated, but not violently. He increased community investment. He strengthened alliances. He made himself indispensable. If the Mafia removed him, they risked destabilizing Harlem entirely. And instability attracts headlines. Headlines attract Washington. Washington threatens everyone. He turned himself from crime boss into political risk. And that changed the calculus. The 5 families didn't retreat, but they adjusted. Private negotiations resumed. New agreements were formed. Percentages were recalculated. Control became shared, not publicly, not officially, but effectively. Harlem operated with semi-autonomy under Bumpy's watch. The Mafia understood something uncomfortable. Dominance isn't always about force. Sometimes it's about coexistence. And Bumpy had forced coexistence. Not through rebellion, through leverage. History often frames it as Mafia versus Bumpy Johnson, as if it were a clear winner and loser. But the truth is more complex. The five families remained powerful. New York remained under their umbrella, but Harlem was never fully absorbed. And Bumpy wasn't reckless. He didn't try to destroy the Mafia. He made them adapt. That's not victory. That's influence. And influence lasts longer than intimidation. In 1968, Bumpy Johnson collapsed in a Harlem diner. A heart attack. No bullets. No ambush. Just silence. The streets didn't erupt. There was no immediate war. But something shifted, because when a power structure is built on one man's strategy, what happens when that man is gone? The five families moved carefully. Harlem adjusted again. New leaders rose. New dynamics formed. But the era of unquestioned dominance had cracked. Not broken. Cracked. And cracks change empires. The five families ruled New York for decades. Their influence stretched across industries and politics. But in Harlem, there was a moment when one man forced them to negotiate. Not with guns, not with rebellion, but with leverage. He understood power, he understood timing, and he understood something most criminals never do. The strongest move isn't attack, it's positioning. Officially, the war in Harlem was never declared. Unofficially, it changed the balance of power forever. And maybe that's the part most people miss, because sometimes the biggest victories don't look like victories at all. They look like survival. And in a city ruled by fear, survival is power.